they took 8 hostages up to the catwalks, blindfolded them, and held knives to their throats. According to the surviving inmates and hostages, there was no intention of actually killing these hostages. The stunt was just an act to act as insurance. Inmates and hostages did not believe that the state would want to kill any of the hostages in the retaking, but unfortunately, once the siege begins shortly after 9:45 a.m., it does not matter whether the inhabitants of the prison were inmates or hostages, because all hell breaks loose.
You're listening to Precinct 444, a podcast network from the National Law Enforcement Museum. Today we're bringing you an episode from Law and Disorder, where we dive into the world of true crime stories with memorable cases that have lasting effects for law enforcement.
Of the more than 24,000 names of fallen law enforcement officers that are engraved onto the walls of the National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial, 950 of those names belong to correctional officers. 10 of those names belong to corrections officers who were killed during the Attica Prison riot in upstate New York in September of 1971, which was regarded as the worst prison riot in United States history. The riot itself lasted 4 days. It began on September 9th of 1971, when prisoners were able to gain access to Times Square, the traffic hub of the prison's above-ground tunnel system. On day 5, the riot ultimately ended in a violent retaking of the prison by New York State Police and the National Guard. When the dust settled after the state's retaking of the prison, 43 men were dead, 33 inmates, and 10 correctional officers and prison employees who had been held hostage. Investigations into the riot and the retaking of the prison determined that only 4 deaths, 1 of a prison guard and 3 of inmates, were not caused by law enforcement action. Ultimately, the inmates' advocacy for not only reform in their own facility, but also prison facilities around the country, was overshadowed by the show of force in the retaking of the prison. Today, we are still learning lessons from Attica, which continues to mark a turning point in American prison reform. But the realities of America's prisons today are far from what the Attica inmates hoped when they staged their uprising. The Attica Corrections Facility is a New York State prison in Attica, New York. Attica is a town that's mostly populated by the employees of the correctional facility and their families, and it lies just a little over 35 miles east of Buffalo, New York, and about 5.5 hours northwest of New York City. Attica Corrections Facility is still in operation today and is a maximum security men's prison under the jurisdiction of the New York State Department of Corrections and Community Supervision. On today's episode of Law and Disorder, we are going to discuss the Attica riot. We're going to talk about the inmates' motivations for the riot, the violent retaking of the prison by the state of New York, and the changes that ultimately came to be for the New York prison system in its aftermath. But before we get to the details of the riot, I think it's very important to discuss how the American public viewed crime and criminal justice in 1971. And to fully understand the importance of the riot at Attica, it's crucial to know what's going on in the rest of the country at the time. So in 1971, the United States was still deep into the war in Vietnam, which seemed more and more dire each day. Information about the counterintelligence program known as COINTELPRO was leaked to the press and Congress after a break-in at an FBI office in Media, Pennsylvania. The program had been approved by National Security Council in 1956 to keep an eye on and disrupt activities of the Communist Party in the United States. It would later expand to include the Socialist Workers' Party in 1961, the KKK in 1964, and the Black Panther Party in 1967, just to name a few. But in 1971, the program was ultimately shut down after criticism from Congress about its infringement on First Amendment rights, and it led to greater oversight regarding the FBI's role in national security investigations. 1971 marked the 3rd year of President Richard Nixon's first term in office, a president who held a notoriously tough stance on crime. Notably, in June of 1971, President Nixon declared drug abuse as public enemy number 1, and he began the war on drugs. Nixon's war on drugs is not to be confused with President Reagan's war on drugs in the 1980s. They are a bit different. Nixon's war on drugs had crucial ties to not only rising crime rates through the United States at the time, but primarily increased heroin use throughout the country, which was happening at alarming rates with Vietnam War veterans returning home from service. Nixon's plan prioritized treatment programs that would combat heroin abuse without penalizing addicts for seeking help. However, these policies also paved the way for movements of mass incarceration for drug-related crimes that continue to persist today. These policies have led to overpopulation in state and federal institutions and poor living conditions for inmates, as well as hostile working environments for correctional officers. Additionally, there had been some other instances of prison violence that year leading up to the riot at Attica, some of which occurred at New York State institutions, like the Auburn Prison, where conflict had been ongoing between inmates and corrections officers between November 2nd of 1970 and June 9th of 1971, and a pair of prisoner uprisings at a Manhattan jail known as the Tombs in 1970. Some of the prisoners who had been involved in uprisings at both Auburn and the Tombs had been transferred to Attica. Most of the violence that had occurred during these events was in response to similar grievances to those held by inmates at Attica. These included concerns about hygiene and prison living conditions, as well as racial tensions between inmates and correctional officers. An additional catalytic moment leading up to the riot at Attica occurred only a few days before the uprising, when George Jackson, a political prisoner and revolutionary behind the Black Panther Party, was murdered at San Quentin Prison in August of 1971. Many of the Attica prisoners were well-read on Jackson's philosophies regarding racial tensions and civil rights in the United States, as well as his stance on prison reform. Inmates at Attica and around the country were outraged by George Jackson's murder and even held a protest on the day after his death, where they refused to eat. All of these contextual elements helped to build the tensions that would ultimately erupt during the inmates' uprising at Attica, but ultimately it was the conditions inside the prison of Attica that led the inmates to stage their siege. Ultimately, the inmates of Attica had a number of concerns that would be synthesized into a list of 30 demands over 4 days of negotiations with the New York Department of Corrections. But before we get to what those demands were, let's go through how inmates were able to take over the prison. The siege of the prison took place on September 9, 1971, but the immediate events that predicated the siege took place the day before. On September 8th, there was an incident in one of the recreation yards where officers mistook 2 inmates sparring as if they were actually fighting. As the ranking and correctional officers approached to respond to the incident, one of the inmates left and blended into the crowd in the yard, while the other tried to explain to himself to the officers that they were not actually fighting, it was just sparring in jest. The ranking officer wouldn't really listen to what the inmate was trying to say, and the inmate was frustrated, and he ended up pushing the officer. According to the panelist and former correctional officer Michael Smith, these types of physical interactions do not often happen in prisons, and for the most part, inmates and officers are respectful of one another's personal space. When other inmates and corrections officers gathered around in response to this incident, it set a precedent, and then it set a second precedent when, instead of pushing the inmate back, the corrections officer backed down and the issue was not pressed. Typical procedure would state that the inmate would immediately be moved to a different area of the facility where the incident would be dealt with. However, that did not happen in this case. Instead, that evening, administration decided the 2 inmates involved in this altercation were to be removed from their cells and placed in solitary confinement. But when the first of the 2 inmates was being removed from his cell, the other inmates of their block began to react violently from their cells. They threw items at officers and began yelling, and because of this reaction, officers decided they would not move the second inmate until morning. He would be separated from other inmates and taken to separation, while all of the inmates in his company were released from their cells for breakfast the next morning. However, when the doors to the cell of this inmate's block were opened and the inmates of the company went to breakfast, one inmate managed to find the electronic block of switches that operates the cell doors and unlocked this particular inmate's cell. So he proceeded to go to breakfast with the rest of his company. Once guards realized that the inmate had been released and went on to breakfast with his company, it was decided the entire company would go back to their cells after breakfast rather than going on to their other daily activities like recreation yards, jobs, etc., until this particular inmate was isolated and taken to solitary confinement. When traveling through the Attica facility, prisoners navigate through an above-ground tunnel system that converges at a communication hub known as Times Square. Traffic through Times Square is controlled by 4 large metal gates that are all opened and closed by skeleton-type keys that are held by the officer that's posted at Times Square. The officer would open these gates individually in order to control traffic between cell blocks and common areas. And in order to pass through Times Square, a company had to move into a corridor behind the gate, and the gate from the other corridor is closed behind them before the Times Square gate is opened by the officer with skeleton keys so that they can pass through. On this morning, the inmate company that contained the inmate who needed to be isolated from the day before was traveling back to A Block through Times Square. When the company was locked into the corridor at A Block, they feared that they were being punished, and some began attacking corrections officers while the others attempted to flee. In the melee, the crowd pushed through the Times Square gate, which had a faulty hinge, and it gave way. Chaos ensued and spread to other nearby companies of inmates, and the inmates attacked the guard, Bill Quinn, took his keys and the telephone that was in Times Square. By taking this telephone, they effectively cut off the prison's communication system, as it was very antiquated. By noon on September 9th of 1971, only half of the prison was under control by prison guards. The other half had been seized by just over 1,200 of Attica's 2,200 inmates. In terms of the geography of the prison, inmates had taken control of D Yard, 2 tunnels, and Times Square, which is the control room. In this seizure of power, they took 42 officers and civilian employees hostage. As soon as the inmates took control of their half of the prison, they began to assemble. Living spaces were moved outside to D Yard in hooches that were akin to how soldiers were living on the front lines in Vietnam. Many of the inmates, and even some of the corrections officers who were now hostages, had served overseas in the Vietnam War. But the inmates also knew that they had to organize and communicate their demands to the state clearly, or the riot would end with dire consequences. They elected representatives to negotiate a list of demands, some of which included requesting an audience of certain members of the media, state and federal legislators, and heads of the New York Department of Corrections. They chose to invite individuals to the prison that they felt would be sympathetic to their cause and understanding of their demands. Ultimately, they had a list of 30 demands that they presented to the state of New York's Department of Corrections. Most of these demands concerned living conditions in the prison. Prior to the riot, due to overcrowding and underfunding, inmates at Attica were only allowed 1 roll of toilet paper per month, 1 shower per week, and medical care was dismal. Inmates wanted access to better food and better education programs. They wanted fair visitation rights, guaranteed religious freedom, and higher wages for inmate jobs. Additionally, inmates wanted to be treated fairly by the guards in the prison, and they wanted the guards to look like them. At the time of the uprising, most of Attica's inmates were Black or Hispanic, and an overwhelming majority of the corrections officers assigned to guard them were white. The final demands of the prisoners was that they be granted amnesty by the state of New York if they were to relinquish control of the facility and hand it back over to the state. On the first day of the riot, this seemed like a steep ask, but it felt somewhat reasonable. There had also been some injuries to inmates and corrections officers, but up to that point there were no fatalities. However, 2 days into the riot, corrections officer Bill Quinn succumbs to his injuries from the initial riot and the hospital. This made ongoing negotiations between the inmates and Commissioner of Corrections Russell Oswald more difficult. Oswald agreed to 28 of the 30 conditions that the inmates had presented, but especially in the wake of Officer Quinn's death, amnesty was off the table. The other request that Oswald refused was the inmates' request to fire the prison's current warden. However, the inmates saw these 2 demands as non-negotiables and continued negotiations for a total of 4 days. Additional tension arose as New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller refused to come to the prison and bear witness to the event himself. Rockefeller, who had hopes of one day becoming the President of the United States, had been regarded as relatively weak on crime, and it was apparent that members of the Republican Party wanted a tough-on-crime stance. From recorded conversations on the phone between Rockefeller and current President Nixon, it was determined that they saw what was happening at Attica as a way to show the American people that Rockefeller could be tough on crime. In order to do this, Rockefeller could not grant amnesty to the inmates involved in the riot, and he needed to take the prison back by any means possible, meaning any level of force necessary. As negotiations continued to deteriorate at Attica, Rockefeller and Oswald agreed that the next step was to call in the National Guard and New York State Police to take the prison back by force. Plans to take back the prison were drawn up on the evening of September 12, 1971, and the next morning, members of the team of observers who were assisting the inmates in their negotiations pled with Commissioner Oswald to attempt to negotiate with the inmates one final time. Oswald agreed, but was instructed by Governor Rockefeller not to phrase it as an ultimatum. He did not want the inmates to know that the retaking of the prison was happening. At 8:25 a.m., Commissioner Oswald made an announcement to the inmates that they needed to release the hostages and accept the final offered settlement within the hour. He did not tell inmates that negotiation with the state was over. Instead, he lied and said, quote, "I want to continue negotiations with you." The inmates ultimately rejected his offer, and morale among the inmates continued to deteriorate, as it appeared that once again the governor was refusing to make any attempt to hear them out. Inmates figured that the state would attempt to take the prison back by force, and they had made preparations for this very early on. While they did not have firearms, some inmates carried makeshift weapons, including shanks, handmade spears, bats, and iron bars that they had taken from around the prison to defend themselves. They had dug trenches in D Yard and fortified the Times Square Control Center as well. Additionally, they took 8 hostages up to the catwalks, blindfolded them, and held knives to their throats. According to the surviving inmates and hostages, there was no intention of actually killing these hostages. The stunt was just an act to act as insurance. Inmates and hostages did not believe that the state would want to kill any of the hostages in the retaking, but unfortunately, once the siege begins shortly after 9:45 a.m., it does not matter whether the inhabitants of the prison were inmates or hostages, because all hell breaks loose. At 9:46 a.m., tear gas was dropped into the yard, and then hundreds of New York State police troopers, National Guardsmen, Bureau of Criminal Investigation personnel, deputy sheriffs, park police, and correctional officers began opening fire into the smoke. These law enforcement officials had a variety of weapons at their disposal, including large and small caliber weapons and even shotguns loaded with buckshot pellets. According to investigations into the riot and the retaking of the prison, many of these weapons were not assigned to particular officers, so it was nearly impossible to determine who fired which rounds that ultimately killed inmates and hostages within the prison. Some of the rounds of ammunition used were unjacketed bullets, a type of ammunition that causes such extreme damage to human flesh that it was later banned by the Geneva Convention. The retaking was a bloodbath, and some of the inmates recalled members of the negotiating team being singled out and targeted during the retaking. By the time the state had regained control of the prison at 10:05 a.m., officers had shot and killed 128 men and killed 9 hostages and 29 inmates. An additional hostage, Correctional Officer Harris W. Whalen, would die in the hospital on October 9th from wounds that he sustained during the retaking. Early media coverage in the aftermath of the riot claimed that the 9 correctional officers turned hostages that were killed during the retaking had had their throats slashed. However, the medical examiner confirmed a few days later that they had all been killed by gunshot wounds during the retaking. These officers had died at the hands of other officers. Investigations into both the riot at Attica and the retaking acknowledged the fatal errors that occurred while taking back the prison with force in such a way. The New York State Special Commission on Attica wrote in their report, quote, "With the exception of Indian massacres in the late 19th century, the state police assault that ended the 4-day prison uprising was the bloodiest one-day encounter between Americans since the Civil War." The general public was rightfully appalled at what happened at Attica, but it took many years for the full story to be fully understood. In 1971, the general public was generally supportive of prison reform and believed that prisoners did deserve rights. When Attica initially happens, the public's initial reaction is one of just wondering what it was all about. When the riot began, the public was genuinely curious about the prisoners' motivations for starting the riot, and the international public was essentially waiting to see what would happen next. However, the public's perception of the prisoners' riot and their reasons for taking control of the prison in the first place would later be overshadowed by the state's method of breaking up the riot. The incredibly violent retaking overshadowed any of the conversations that had been had about inmates' rights and the racial disparities in the prison system that Attica was bringing to light through the media. Additionally, in the aftermath of the riot, it seemed that the stories of the survivors of the Attica riot, from both the inmates and the hostages' perspective, came second to how the state broke up the riot. Ultimately, the New York State Special Commission on Attica was established by Governor Rockefeller in November of 1971, and when they released their report the next year, they were highly critical of Rockefeller, the Department of Corrections, and the New York State Police for their handling of the prison retaking and for negligence in protecting the inmates from reprisals after the riot. And while it took many decades for legal proceedings against former inmates who were charged in the wake of the riot, and the civil suits against the state of New York to be settled in the aftermath of the riot, there were changes that were made to the New York State correctional system that are a direct result of Attica. The following changes were made almost immediately and implemented statewide. They included access to basics, such as more showers, soap, medical care, and family visits, the creation of a grievance procedure which allowed inmates to report actions by staff members that violated published policy, the creation of liaison committees which allowed inmates to elect representatives to speak for them in meetings with prison officials, the allocation of funding for prisoners' legal services, which is a statewide network of lawyers to assist inmates, as well as greater access to higher education and allowing more religious freedom to inmates. Unfortunately, during the tough-on-crime eras of the 1980s through the 1990s, some of these protections were lessened or even reversed. One example comes from the 1994 Crime Bill, which eliminated all Pell Grants for prisoners and resulted in the defunding of higher education programs within prisons, ending many university-level education opportunities within prisons. Additionally, prison overcrowding increased across the country with mandatory minimum sentences. Obviously, we still have a long way to go with prison reform in our country, but Attica was a crucial event that 50 years ago forced our country to take a long and painful look at the realities of life in America's prison system. While mistakes were certainly made, taking the time to understand Attica, where it fits in the context of American history, and the lessons that we still need to take the time to learn from the event, we can further shape American prison reform in a way that makes prisons safer for both inmates and the corrections officers who work within these facilities. If you haven't already, I encourage you to listen to the last two-part episode of our Encore series, where we published a past program titled Attica Beyond the Riot. Two of the panelists for this program were correctional officers at Attica who were taken as hostages during the riot. In order to eliminate redundancy, I didn't reiterate their stories in today's episode. I also think their stories are better told directly from them. But I would encourage you to listen to these episodes. The program itself was very crucial for me when I was writing this episode. Additionally, the documentary Attica, which was directed by Stanley Nelson and premiered on September 9th, 2021, on the 50th anniversary of the beginning of the uprising, goes into detail of the inmates' perspective on the Attica riot. They detail the intricacies of the negotiations that were happening during those 4 days, and it's a powerful watch. I found the documentary streaming on Paramount+. Online sources like the New York State Archives also have great resources about the Attica riot, including detailed timelines of legal proceedings that occurred in the wake of the riots. I highly recommend searching this topic yourself and digging in a little deeper. I hope that you enjoyed today's episode of Precinct 444. We release a new Law and Disorder episode on the last Wednesday of every month, and we really enjoy digging deeper into crucial cases and events in law enforcement and criminal justice history. You can find all of our past episodes on our website at www.nleomf.org or streaming anywhere where you listen to your podcasts. I hope you have a great day, and we will see you again soon here at the Precinct.
Please subscribe to Precinct 444 on your favorite podcasting platform to stay connected and to receive our latest content as soon as it drops. We would love to hear from you. Send in your questions, comments, and feedback to precinct444@nleomf.org. You can help us make our content even better. The National Law Enforcement Museum is located at 444 East Street Northwest in Washington, D.C., and is dedicated to telling the story of American law enforcement. We expand and enrich the relationship between law enforcement and the community through educational journeys, immersive exhibitions, and insightful programs. Find us online at lawenforcementmuseum.org and stay tuned for more podcast content from Precinct 444. Until next time, stay safe. We'll see you at the Precinct.